Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, January 3rd. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 242 days, the game against Michigan in 326 days. And the big question today is who will be coaching the Wolverines in that game in 326 days? It might be Jim Harbaugh, but according to a report in The Athletic that dropped on January 2nd, during all the day after New Year's Day bowl games, Jim Harbaugh is once again perhaps we're going to have another cycle where Jim Harbaugh flirts with the NFL and maybe leaves Michigan. And boy, that is a story that Ohio State fans tend to be very interested in. So Tony Gerdeman is here to help break it all down for me, Tony. And, I know last year, after last year's whole rigmarole where he was maybe going to go to the Vikings and then didn't go to the Vikings, that he said, okay, that's it. If I'm not going now, I'm going to stay. But according to this report, it sure sounds like sources close to Jim Harbaugh think that maybe he is not, in fact, done batting his eyes at the NFL.
Yeah, it reminds me of the time that Punxsutawney Phil didn't see a shadow and was like, you know what, I'm not doing it next year. I'm not even going to look next year. I'm done with the shadow stuff. But here we are again. It's winter, and so that means it's time for Jim Harbaugh's name to be mentioned. And, we talked about this happening a few weeks back, and I said it might be one of those things where Jim Harbaugh's agent is just making a move to get Jim Harbaugh's money back that he basically gave up because he went flirting, and so then he had to sign an extension that wasn't as agreeable as it could have been. And now, having gotten them to the playoffs 2 years in a row, he might want to be paid in that same realm. However, we also know he wants to go to the NFL because he has been looking at the NFL for a long time. And so, yeah, I know at this point, not at this point last year, but at some point last year, I think we may have both been under the assumption that he was done. And now maybe he's done again.
Yeah, it's you get these conflicting quotes, and the quote, the money quote from the Athletic piece that everyone is kind of passing around is, quote, "I think it is a done deal if he gets an offer," and that was a source close to Jim Harbaugh. Harbaugh himself early December said, quote, "I will be back enthusiastically coaching the Wolverines in 2023, which, I mean, if we want to be really technical, I don't know how enthusiastic he is today, but he is coaching the Wolverines in 2023. So we'll see if that holds up. But, I think this is a time when it is not the most fun time in history to be a college football coach with NIL and the transfer portal and a lot of that power balance between players and coaches sort of swinging away from coaches and towards players. And I think I would not necessarily take any coach who is a college football coach right now who has an opportunity to go to the NFL and say, no, they would never do that, because it seems right now like being an NFL coach might be a lot better quality of life, and you're probably making substantially the same money too.
100%. And for somebody like Jim Harbaugh, who is a bit of an odd duck at times dealing with all of this and the focus being on football. For a lot of guys, the focus is NIL. What am I getting? What can you do for me? It's not about a 40-year decision that he likes to preach, that a lot of schools like to preach. It's about a 4-month decision more than anything else for a lot of these guys. And you see Michigan losing players to the portal, the NIL issue, the collectives. You're dealing with, not only are you dealing with keeping the AD happy and keeping the president happy, now you're dependent on collectives helping you out. And then what are they asking for return? How much power and sway are they looking for? The recruiting as it is now, and then recruiting your own players year after year. It's beyond a full-time job. There aren't enough hours in a day to be the coach and also to be the head lead recruiter of a team that you've already recruited. So I don't fault any college head coach or any essentially college coach for heading to the NFL when it's not a 40-hour week job, but you know what the job is day in and day out. Every single day in college football, something new pops up, and now it's like, well, I've got to set aside what I was going to do today to try to figure out how to get my backup linebacker a little bit more money so that he doesn't go into the portal for somebody else. And it's just every day is something new like that. And when can I be head coach if I am also having to be agent, contract designer, all these different things that shouldn't have come into play in terms of what the coach does. And, the schools weren't supposed to have anything to do with this stuff, but it is what it is. And there's just way more than being a head coach involved in being a head coach in college football now.
And it's not just an hours in the week thing either. It's a weeks in the year. There are times in the NFL calendar where NFL head coaches have some time off, and they don't, this is not a year-round recruiting thing. There is a free agency period in the NFL, and then once that's done, courting season is over for the most part, and there is a draft season, and then once that's done for the most part, and then you've got some mini camps and that kind of stuff. But it is not a 24/7. You are not texting 17-year-olds on your phone at 3:00 on a Tuesday afternoon in May. You don't have to deal with that if you're an NFL coach. Being a college coach is much more of a year-round thing where you kind of get after camp seasons in June and then before media days in July, college coaches have like about a 3-week stretch where most of them will kind of disappear. Other than that, guys are around the facility, and if they're not around the facility, they're on their phones quite a bit. It is you don't really get to turn off really as a college coach right now. That's one of the other kind of substantial differences between the two leagues or the two levels. And one of the reasons that I absolutely could see Harbaugh trying to move up. And like I said, this is not specifically a Harbaugh thing, but Harbaugh has the NFL pedigree. Harbaugh has the success at the college level now that he would certainly be towards the front of the list of those contenders to those various jobs. There are a couple jobs that he has been linked to. One of the Broncos. The report said that they're going to be, quote, ultra aggressive about their top 3 targets, including Harbaugh, but also Sean Payton and Dan Quinn. So that is one where they're taking a pretty serious look at him. The other one is the Indianapolis Colts. He, of course, is in the Colts Ring of Honor. Would make a lot of sense. He actually has coached football at a level higher than high school in the last few years, so he's more qualified than the current guy there. I mean, there are a couple spots here where, last year we were talking about the Vikings, and it was like, yeah, okay, he didn't take the Vikings job, okay. But if a job like the Colts comes open, it will be hard for him to say no. Well, here we are, the Colts job is open. It feels like if it's offered, it's going to be hard for him to say no.
Well, and we know Colts owner Robert Irsay will offer to just about anybody, so that would make Jim Harbaugh a pleasing candidate. But he, as you said, he's in the Ring of Honor. He has a familiarity there. There is a name recognition there. And, Denver is such a mess, but that doesn't seem, does that matter to Jim Harbaugh at this point? If you want to get back into the NFL, how choosy can you be when every year somebody being fired, it's from a team that is doing poorly? So you're going to start, some places are better to start after a bad season. Other places are, worse, and it depends on the franchises and things like that. But going in, like, you're not going to start somebody from a 14-3 team isn't going to retire and be like, I'm done. And so it's like, ooh, I would like that. That's the job that I want. You're going to have to go to a place with some issues. So, I wonder how much it matters to him how bad things are for that program this year. It may just depend on what do their draft picks look like. What is the young nucleus? That's why Doug Peterson taking the Jacksonville job was such an easy choice for him, because there was a lot there to build upon. And so maybe this comes down to, the way The Athletic put it, it's like, if anybody comes calling, he's going to answer. And that may be put to the test.
You can kind of look at two different sides of this. One is, what's the case for him to go? Setting aside the hours of work and all that kind of stuff, just purely looking at the Michigan program right now, setting aside the NFL piece of this, he's got them at a spot where they haven't been in decades. They have beaten Ohio State 2 years in a row for the first time since 1999 and 2000. They have won the Big Ten 2 years in a row for the first time since 2003, 2004. They've made the college football playoff 2 years in a row. Now, they've also lost in the college football playoff 2 years in a row. Last year, they got whomped by Georgia. This year, it sure seemed like everything was setting up, and then they came up just short against TCU. I think it would be relatively easy for him to say, boy, we got so close. We have another year where there's a 4-team playoff. J.J. McCarthy's coming back. Donovan Edwards is coming back. You have the core. They have shown that they can just kind of rebuild an offensive line. The defensive staff, I mean, we'll see what kind of continuity they have on the staff, but it feels like they're back in this conversation again next year. It would be relatively easy for Harbaugh to say, okay, let's run it back one more time, and then we'll see. Someone is going to get fired in the NFL this time next year. Run it back one more time and see.
Yeah, I think, to me, that would be the smartest decision, because you will have one more year of J.J. McCarthy. You have the plan in place, the plan that has worked, you can continue to do. You've got another terrible non-conference schedule to make sure that you get those 3 free wins. You don't have to worry about any losses in the non-conference schedule. You've got Ohio State at home. Next year would be set up to be their most probable playoff season of the last 3, maybe. And so why go now? That sort of thing. Maybe he's thinking, I can leave them on a high note, as we've seen like Bob Stoops do, and Urban Meyer. Like you leave when you've raised a program higher than it was when you got there, but you can also do that one after next year, like you said, because I don't know that the recruiting has been there. And once you lose the playmakers that they're going to lose after next year, I don't know what's waiting in the wings for Michigan. And I say that because there's nothing waiting in the wings for Michigan at this point to replace J.J. McCarthy and Donovan Edwards and the receivers, the group of receivers that they have. They're going to be losing some this year. They recruited some good guys, some top-rated guys in the 2022 class. We haven't seen them do anything just yet, but that doesn't mean they won't. But I think next year is probably the year if he's going to do it, and maybe you get a bump this year and then an ability to lower any type of buyout. I don't think there's much of a buyout anyway, but it will be interesting to see if there is some sort of an extension or bump, which would be maybe just a 1-year cash grab, because I'm with you. I think next year is the better time. But, if the job that he wants, or a job that he wants, comes calling, we've seen that he was looking after last year. So playoffs don't seem to really factor in terms of his decision. And I wonder if that's, I honestly think he's gotten them as high as he can. This is the extent of where Michigan can go under Jim Harbaugh, and getting them there 2 years in a row is pretty good.
It is pretty good. And if you look at the recruiting rankings for this year, the 2023 cycle, coming off of a win over Ohio State Big Ten championship, making the college football playoff, typically you see that bump that next year. You don't get the bump the cycle where you do it. You get the bump the cycle afterwards. They're 17th in the recruiting rankings this year. And you can chalk that up to, Harbaugh's NFL dalliances. You can chalk that up to, Michigan folks will tell you it's got a lot to do with Michigan's admission standards. Whatever you want to say, the recruiting has not really been at the Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, that type of level. And because of that, I think when you go to a 12-team playoff, it feels like it's a much harder path for Michigan once it gets to a 12-team playoff. And you have to not just win 2 games, you have to win 3 games or potentially 4 games if you are one of the lower seeds. It's a harder path because you got to go through more quality teams. You need more quality depth on your roster. It feels to me, Tony, like next year is kind of their last best chance too. And at that point, if you have a dip, if you lose, you lose at Penn State in the whiteout next year, and then Ohio State beats you, or someone else beats you, and you're 10-2 next year, and then your star is not quite so shiny, you miss the playoff, then you've got to try and deal with the 12-team thing. I think there's also an argument that this is, if you decide you really want to go, if you really decide for whatever reason, and I think the recruiting calendar and all of that and NIL is a perfectly viable reason, then you get, the getting's good. I think this is one of those things where there's an argument on both sides for him that you could stay, but also this would also be a very logical time to sell high and get out while the getting's good.
Yeah, that is for sure. And as I said, I think, is he going to start getting this label that, or why hasn't he gotten a label that he can't win the big one? Because the last time they ended the season, Michigan ended the season with a win, I believe it was 2015. And that goes back to bowl games. That goes back to losing to Penn State in 2020, their season finale, to finish 2-4. But, this has not been he can get them so far, but then you can't go above that. And now if you're playing in a 12-team playoff, you can't hide your non-conference schedule anymore, because like you will play a non-conference schedule in the postseason. So you're going to have to play more, several good teams to win it all, instead of just one or two like they do now. And so it's going to become more difficult to win it. It may be easier to make it, but I don't think making the playoffs is going to be all that special, because now you're going to be judged for losing in the playoffs even more so. Some people, you look at what Oklahoma or Lincoln Riley has done in the playoffs. Brian Day has gotten a bad rap in the playoffs for losing some games. Jim Harbaugh at this point, 0-2 in the playoffs, at 1-1, it was a favorite this year, and has didn't show up the year before. What happens when they now have to go through 2 or 3 or 4 teams to win it all? And I just don't see them having the depth and the overall talent to do that. And that's why one last swing at it next year to try and win it all, but I just don't think they have it.
Yeah, and I think you maybe saw a variation on this last year when Brian Kelly left Notre Dame to go to LSU, where Brian Kelly felt like he had hit his sort of glass ceiling at Notre Dame, where you have a great season, you win, you go 12-0, maybe 11-1, you pick up a good win or two, you get into the playoffs, and then you just get clobbered by whatever SEC team you're playing Alabama, you're playing LSU, whichever team you run into that year, you play Clemson, they get walloped. And you wonder if Jim Harbaugh has sort of seen the writing on the wall there at Michigan, where are you ever going to be able to recruit enough big dudes on the defensive line and enough speed and skill talent guys? Are you ever going to be able to do that at Michigan? Because so far they haven't. They have made it work with what they've got, but what they've got gets you to a certain point, and does he feel he can take that next step? Maybe you can, but that's not a given, and you have some institutional barriers there that you don't have at Notre Dame, for example. You have some institutional barriers that do not exist at LSU in terms of admissions and all of that kind of stuff. You wonder if Harbaugh might be sort of looking at that as he's not going to LSU, but maybe you go somewhere else for somewhat the same general reason. So this, I'm sure, will be a story we will talk about once or twice more over the coming days and weeks as things start to sort of play out with the end of the NFL season, and Black Monday is coming and all of that. So we will probably have a substantial update on all of that stuff coming for you a little later on this week and this month. There's also a bunch of Ohio State stuff to talk about as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. Big basketball game coming up, Purdue coming to town this week. The women's basketball team number 3 in the country, the women's hockey team number 1 in the country. There is a lot of interesting stuff going on at Ohio State right now, and you can follow along with all of it at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We'll be covering all sorts of fun stuff. Now that football season's over, we got a little more time, and we'll be talking about all of it here as well as on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. So thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.